The Never-Ending Story, Chapter 3, Morla the Aged One. Chiron, the old black centaur, sank back on his bed of furs as Artak's hoofbeats were dying away. After so much exertion, he was at the end of his strength. The woman who found him next day in Atreyu's tent feared for his life, and when the hunters came home a few days later, he was hardly any better. But he managed, nevertheless, to tell them why Atreyu had ridden away and would not be back soon. As they were all fond of the boy, their concern for him made them grave. Still, they were proud that the childlike empress had chosen him for the great quest, though none claimed to understand her choice. Old Chiron never went back to the ivory tower, but he didn't die, and he didn't stay with the greenskins in the grassy ocean. His destiny was to lead him over very different and unexpected pathways. But that is another story, and shall be told another time. The same night, Atreyu rode to the foot of the Silver Mountains. It was almost morning when he finally stopped to rest. Artax grazed a while and drank water from a small mountain stream. Atreyu wrapped himself in his red cloak and slept a few hours, but when the sun rose, they were already on their way. On the first day, they crossed the Silver Mountains, where every road and trail was known to them, and they made quick progress. When he felt hungry, the boy ate a chunk of dried buffalo meat and 2 little grass seed cakes that he had been carrying in his saddlebag. Originally, they had been intended for his hunt. "Exactly," said Bastian. "A man has to eat now and then." He took his sandwich out of his satchel, unwrapped it, broke it carefully into 2 pieces, wrapped one of them up again, and put it away. Then he ate the other. Recess was over. Bastian wondered what his class would be doing next. Oh yes, geography with Mrs. Flint. You had to reel off rivers and their tributaries, cities, population figures, natural resources, and industries. Bastian shrugged his shoulders and went on reading. By sunset, the Silver Mountains lay behind them, and again they stopped to rest. That night, Atreyu dreamed of purple buffaloes. He saw them in the distance, roaming over the grassy ocean, and he tried to get near them on his horse. In vain. He galloped, he spurred his horse, but they were always the same distance away. The second day they passed through the singing tree country. Each tree had a different shape, different leaves, different bark, but all of them in growing, and this was what gave that country its name. It made soft music that sounded from far and near and joined in a mighty harmony that hadn't its like for beauty in all Fantastica. Riding through this country wasn't entirely devoid of danger, for many a traveler had stopped still as though spellbound and forgotten everything else. Atreyu felt the power of these marvelous sounds, but didn't let himself be tempted to stop. The following night, he dreamed again of purple buffaloes. This time he was on foot, and a great herd of them was passing. But they were beyond the range of his bow, and when he tried to come closer, his feet clung to the ground, and he couldn't move them. His frantic efforts to tear them loose woke him up. He started out at once, though the sun had not yet risen. The third day, he saw the glass tower of Eribo, where the inhabitants of the region caught and stored starlight. Out of the starlight, they made wonderfully decorative objects, the purpose of which, however, was known to no one in all Fantastica but their makers. He met some of these folks, little creatures they were, who seemed to have been blown from glass. They were extremely friendly and provided him with food and drink, but when he asked them who might know something about the childlike empress's illness, They sank into a gloomy, perplexed silence. The next night, Atreyu dreamed again that the herd of purple buffaloes was passing. One of the beasts, a particularly large, imposing bull, broke away from his fellows and slowly, with no sign of either fear or anger, approached Atreyu. Like all true hunters, Atreyu knew every creature's vulnerable spot, where an arrow would be fatal. The purple buffalo put himself in such a position as to offer a perfect target. Atreyu fitted an arrow to his bow and pulled with all of his might, but he couldn't shoot. His fingers seemed to have grown into the bowstring, and he couldn't release it. Each of the following nights he dreamed something of the sort. He got closer and closer to the same purple buffalo. He recognized him by a white spot on his forehead, but for some reason he was never able to shoot the deadly arrow. During the days, he rode farther and farther without knowing where he was going or finding anyone to advise him. The golden amulet he wore was respected by all who met him, but none had an answer to his question. One day he saw from afar the flaming streets of Salamander, the city whose inhabitants' bodies are afire, but he preferred to keep away from it. He crossed the broad plateau of the Sassafranians, who were born old and die when they become babies. He came to the jungle temple of Muwamath, where a grey moonstone pillar hovers in midair, and he spoke to the monks who lived there. And again, no one could tell him anything. He had been traveling aimlessly for almost a week, when on the 7th day and the following night, two very different encounters changed his situation and state of mind. Chiron's story of the terrible happenings in all parts of Fantastica had made an impression on him, but thus far the disaster was something he had only heard about. On the 7th day, he was to see it with his own eyes. Toward noon, he was riding through a dense, dark forest of enormous, gnarled trees. This was the same howling forest where the four messengers had met some time before. That region, as Atreyu knew, was the home of bark trolls. These, as he had been told, were giants and giantesses who themselves looked like gnarled tree trunks. As long as they stood motionless, as they usually did, you could easily mistake them for trees and ride on unsuspecting. Only when they moved could you see that they had branch-like arms and crooked, root-like legs. Though exceedingly powerful, they were not dangerous. At most, they liked to play tricks on travelers who had lost their way. Atreyu had just discovered a woodland meadow with a brook twinning through it, and had dismounted to let Artax drink and graze. Suddenly he heard a loud crackling and thudding in the woods behind him. 3 bark trolls emerged from the woods and came toward him. A cold shiver ran down his spine at the sight of them. The first, having no legs or haunches, was obliged to walk on his hands. The second had a hole in his chest, so big you could see through it. The third hopped on his right foot because the whole left half of him was missing, as if he had been cut through the middle. When they saw the amulet hanging from Atreyu's neck, they nodded to one another and came slowly closer. "Don't be afraid," said the one who was walking on his hands, and his voice sounded like the groaning of a tree. "We're not exactly pretty to look at, but in this part of Howling Forest, there's no one else left who might warn you. That's why we've come." "Warn?" Atreyu asked. "Against what?" "We've heard about you," moaned the one with the hole in his chest, "and we've been told about your quest. Don't go any further in this direction or you'll be lost." "The same thing will happen to you as happened to us," sighed the aft one. "Would you like that?" What has happened to you? Atreyu asked. The nothing is spreading, groaned the first. It's growing and growing, and there's more of it every day, if it's possible to speak of more nothing. All the others fled from Howling Forest in time, but we didn't want to leave our home. The nothing caught us in our sleep, and this is what it did to us. Is it very painful? Atreyu asked. No, said the second bark troll, the one with the hole in his chest. You don't feel a thing. There's just something missing. And once it gets hold of you, something more is missing every day. Soon there won't be anything left of us. In what part of the woods did it begin? Atreyu asked. Would you like to see it? The third troll, who was only half a troll, turned to his fellow sufferers with a questioning look. When they nodded, he said, We'll take you to a place where there's a good view of it, but you must promise not to go any closer. If you do, it will pull you in. All right, said Atreyu. I promise. The three turned about and made for the edge of the forest, leading Artax by the bridle. Atreyu followed them. For a while they went this way and that way between enormous trees. They finally stopped at the foot of a giant tree so big that 5 grown men holding hands could scarcely have girdled it. Climb as high as you can, said the legless troll, and look in the direction of the sunrise. Then you'll see, or rather not see it. Atreyu pulled himself up by the knots and bumps on the tree. He reached the lower branches, hoisted himself to the next, climbed and climbed until he lost sight of the ground below him. Higher and higher he went. The trunk grew thinner, and the more closely spaced side branches made it easier to climb. When at last he reached the crown, he turned toward the sunrise, and then he saw it. The tops of the trees nearest him were still green, but the leaves of those farther away seemed to have lost all color. They were gray. A little farther on, the foliage seemed to become strangely transparent, misty, or better still, unreal. And farther still there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a bare stretch, not darkness, not some lighter color. No, it was something the eyes could not bear, something that made you feel you had gone blind. For no eye can bear the sight of utter nothingness. Atreyu held his hand before his face and nearly fell off his branch. He clung tight for a moment, then climbed down as fast as he could. He had seen enough. At last, he really understood the horror that was spreading through Fantastica. When he reached the foot of the great tree, the 3 bark trolls had vanished. Atreyu swung himself into the saddle and galloped as fast as Artax would carry him in the direction that would take him away from this slowly but irresistibly spreading nothing. By nightfall, he had left Howling Forest far behind him. Only then did he stop to rest. That night, a second encounter, which was to give his great quest a new direction, awaited him. He dreamed, much more distinctly than before, of the purple buffalo he had wanted to kill. This time, Atreyu was without his bow and arrow. He felt very, very small, and the buffalo's face filled the whole sky. And the face spoke to him. He couldn't understand every word, but this is the gist of what it said. If you had killed me, you would be a hunter now. But because you let me live, I can help you, Atreyu. Listen to me. There is in Fantastica a being older than all other beings. In the north, far, far from here, lie the swamps of sadness. In the middle of those swamps there is a mountain. Tortoise Shell Mountain, it's called. There lives Morla, the aged one. Go and see Morla, the aged one. Then Atreyu woke up. The clock in the belfry struck 12. Soon, Bastian's classmates would be going down to the gym for their last class. Today, they'd probably be playing with the big, heavy medicine ball which Bastian handled so awkwardly that neither of the two teams ever wanted him. And sometimes they played with a small, hard rubber ball that hurt terribly when it hit you. Bastian was an easy mark and was always getting hit full force. Or perhaps they'd be climbing rope, an exercise that Bastian especially detested. Most of the others would be all the way to the top, while he, with his face as red as a beet, would be dangling like a sack of flour at the very bottom of the rope, unable to climb as much as a foot. They'd all be laughing their heads off, and Mr. Mange, the gym teacher, had a special stock of jibs just for Bastian. Bastian would have given a good deal to be like Atreyu. He'd have shown them. He heaved a deep sigh. Atreyu rode northward, ever northward. He allowed himself and his little horse only the most necessary stops for sleep and food. He rode by day and he rode by night, in the scorching sun and the pelting rain. He looked neither to the left nor to the right and asked no more questions. The farther northward he went, the darker it grew. An unchanging, leaden-grey twilight filled the days. At night, the northern lights played across the sky. One morning, when time seemed to be standing still in the murky light, he looked out from a hilltop and finally glimpsed the swamps of sadness. Clouds of mist drifted over them. Here and there he distinguished little clumps of trees. Their trunks divided at the bottom into 4, 5, or more crooked stilts, which made the trees look like great many-legged crabs standing in the black water. From the brown foliage hung aerial roots resembling motionless tentacles. It was next to impossible to make out where there was solid ground between the pools of water and where there was only a covering of water plants. Artax whinnied with horror. "Are we going in there, master?" "Yes," said Atreyu. "We must find Tortoise Shell Mountain. It's at the center of those swamps." He urged Artax on, and Artax obeyed. Step by step, he tested the firmness of the ground, but that made progress very slow. At length, Atreyu dismounted and led Artax by the bridle. Several times the horse sank in, but managed to pull himself loose. But the farther they went into the swamps of sadness, the more sluggish became his movements. He let his head droop and barely dragged himself forward. "Artax," said Atreyu, "what's the matter?" "I don't know, master. I think we should turn back. There's no sense in all this. We're chasing after something you only dreamed about. We won't find anything. Maybe it's too late even now. Maybe the childlike empress is already dead, and everything we're doing is useless. Let us turn back, master." Atreyu was astonished. "Artax," he said, "you've never spoken like this. What's the matter? Are you sick?" "Maybe I am," said Artax. "With every step we take, the sadness grows in my heart. I've lost hope, master, and I feel so heavy, I can't go on." "But we must go on," cried Atreyu. "Come along, Artax." He tugged at the bridle, but Artax stood still. He had sunk in up to his belly, and he made no further effort to extricate himself. "Artax!" cried Atreyu. "You mustn't let yourself go. Come, pull yourself out, or you'll sink." "Leave me, master," said the little horse. "I can't make it. Go on alone. Don't bother about me. I can't stand the sadness anymore. I want to die." Desperately, Atreyu pulled at the bridle, but the horse sank deeper and deeper. When only his head emerged from the black water, Atreyu took it in his arms. "I'll hold you, Artax," he whispered. "I won't let you go under." The little horse uttered one last soft neigh. "You can't help me, master. It's all over for me. Neither of us knew what we were getting into. Now we know why they are called the swamps of sadness. It's the sadness that has made me so heavy. That's why I'm sinking. There is no help." "But I'm here, too," said Atreyu, "and I don't feel anything." "You're wearing the gem, master," said Artax. "It protects you." "Then I'll hang it around your neck," Atreyu cried. "Maybe it'll protect you too." He started taking the chain off his neck. "No," the little horse whinnied. "You mustn't do that, master. The glory was entrusted to you. You weren't given permission to pass it on as you see fit. You must carry on the quest without me." Atreyu pressed his face into the horse's cheek. "Artax," he whispered. "Oh, my Artax, will you grant me my last wish?" the little horse asked. Atreyu nodded in silence. "Then I beg you to go away. I don't want you to see my end. Will you do me that favor?" Slowly, Atreyu arose. Half the horse's head was already in the black water. "Farewell, Atreyu, my master," he said, "and thank you." Atreyu pressed his lips together. He couldn't speak. Once again he nodded to Artax, then he turned away. Bastian was sobbing. He couldn't help it. His eyes filled with tears, and he couldn't go on reading. He had to take out his handkerchief and blow his nose before he could go on. Atreyu waited and waited. For how long he didn't know. The mist grew thicker, and he felt as if he were blind and deaf. It seemed to him that he had been wandering around in circles for hours. He stopped, worrying about where to set his foot down, and yet he never sank in above his knees. By some mysterious means, the childlike Empress's amulet led him the right way. Then suddenly he saw a high, steep mountain ahead of him. Pulling himself up from crag to crag, he climbed to the rounded top. At first he didn't notice what this mountain was made of, but from the top he overlooked the whole mountain, and then he saw that it consisted of great slabs of tortoise shell, with moss growing in the crevices between them. He had found Tortoise Shell Mountain. But the discovery gave him no pleasure. Now that his faithful little horse was gone, it left him almost indifferent. Still, he would have to find out who this Morla the Aged One was, and where she actually lived. While he was mulling it over, he felt a slight tremor shaking the mountain. Then he heard a hideous wheezing and lip-smacking, and a voice that seemed to issue from the innermost bowels of the earth. "Sakes alive, old woman, somebody's crawling around on us." In hurrying to the end of the ridge where the sounds had come from, Atreyu had slipped on a bed of moss. Since there was nothing for him to hold on to, he slid faster and faster and finally fell off the mountain. Luckily, he landed on a tree which caught him in its branches. Looking back at the mountain, he saw an enormous cave. Water was splashing and gushing inside, and something was moving. Slowly, the something came out. It looked like a boulder as big as a house. When it came into full sight, Atreyu saw that it was a head attached to a long, wrinkled neck, the head of a turtle. Its eyes were black and as big as palms. The mouth was dripping with muck and water weeds. This whole Tortoise Shell Mountain, it suddenly dawned on Atreyu, was one enormous beast, a giant swamp turtle, Morla the Aged One. The wheezing, gurgling voice spoke again. "What are you doing here, son?" Atreyu reached for the amulet on his chest and held it in such a way that the great eyes couldn't help seeing it. "Do you recognize this, Morla?" She took a while to answer. "Sakes alive, Orin! We haven't seen that in a long time, have we, old woman? The emblem of the childlike empress. Not in a long time." "The childlike empress is sick," said Atreyu. "Did you know that?" "It's all the same to us, isn't it, old woman?" Morla replied. She seemed to be talking to herself, perhaps because she had no one else to talk to for heaven knows how long. "If we don't save her, she'll die," Atreyu cried out. "The nothing is spreading everywhere. I've seen it myself." Morla stared at him out of her great empty eyes. "We don't mind, do we, old woman?" "But then we shall all die," Atreyu screamed. "Every last one of us." "Sakes alive," said Morla. "But what do we care? Nothing matters to us anymore. It's all the same to us." "But you'll be destroyed too, Morla," cried Atreyu angrily. "Or do you expect, because you're so old, to outlive Fantastica?" "Sakes alive," Morla gurgled. "We're old, son. Much too old. Lived long enough. Seen too much. When you know as much as we do, nothing matters. Things just repeat. Day and night, summer and winter. The world is empty and aimless. Everything circles around. Whatever starts up must pass away. Whatever is born must die. It all cancels out, good and bad, beautiful and ugly. Everything is empty. Nothing is real. Nothing matters." Atreyu didn't know what to answer. The aged one's dark, empty, pawn-sized eyes paralyzed his thoughts. After a while, he heard her speak again. "You were young, son. If you were as old as we are, you'd know there's nothing but sadness. Why shouldn't we die, you and I? The childlike empress, the whole lot of us. Anyway, it's all flim-flam, meaningless games, nothing matters. Leave us in peace, son. Go away." Atreyu tensed, his will to fight off the paralysis that flowed from her eyes. "If you know so much," he said, "you must know what the childlike empress's illness is, and whether there's a cure for it." We do, don't we, old woman?" Morla wheezed. "But it's all the same to us, whether she's saved or not. So why should we tell you?" "If it's really all the same to you," Atreyu argued, "you might just as well tell me." We could. Couldn't we, old woman?" Morla grunted. "But we don't feel like it." "Then it's not all the same to you. Then you yourself don't believe what you're saying." After a long silence, he heard a deep gurgling and belching. That must have been some kind of laughter, if Morla the aged one was still capable of laughing. In any case, she said, "You're a sly one, son. Really sly. We haven't had so much fun in a long time, have we, old woman? Sakes alive, it's true. We might just as well tell you. Makes no difference. Should we tell him, old woman? A long silence followed. Atreyu waited anxiously for Morla's answer, taking care not to interrupt the slow, cheerless flow of her thoughts. At last she spoke. Your life is short, son. Ours is long. Much too long. But we both live in time. You a short time, we a long time. The childlike empress has always been there, but she's not old. She has always been young. She still is. Her life isn't measured by time, but by names. She needs a new name. She keeps needing new names. Do you know her name, son? No, Atreyu admitted. I never heard it. You couldn't have, said Morla. Not even we can remember it. Yet she has had many names. But they're all forgotten, over and done with. But without a name she can't live. All the childlike empress needs is a new name. Then she'll get well. But it makes no difference whether she gets well or not. She closed her palm-sized eyes and began slowly to pull in her head. Wait! Cried Atreyu. Where can she get a name? Who can give her one? Where can I find the name? None of us, Morla gurgled. No inhabitant of Fantastica can give her a new name. So it's hopeless. Sakes alive. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Who then? Cried Atreyu in despair. Who can give her the name that will save her and save us all? Don't make so much noise, said Morla. Leave us in peace and go away. Even we don't know who can give her a name. If you don't know, Atreyu screamed even louder, who does? She opened her eyes a last time. If you weren't wearing the gem, she wheezed, we'd eat you up. Just to have peace and quiet, sakes alive. Who? Atreyu insisted. Tell me who knows, and I'll leave you in peace forever. It doesn't matter, she replied. But maybe Uyulala in the Southern Oracle knows. She may know. It's all the same to us. How can I get there? You can't get there at all, son. Not in 10,000 days' journey. Your life is too short. You die first. It's too far. In the south, much too far. So it's all hopeless. We told you so in the first place, didn't we, old woman? Sakes alive, son. Give it up. And most important, leave us in peace. With that, she closed her empty gazing eyes and pulled her head back into the cave for good. Atreyu knew he would learn no more from her. At the same time, the shadowy being, which had condensed out of the darkness of the heat, picked up Atreyu's trail and headed for the swamps of sadness. Nothing and no one in all of Fantastica would deflect it from that trail. Bastian had propped his head on his hand and was looking thoughtfully into space. Strange, he said aloud, that no one in all Fantastica can give the childlike Empress a new name. If it had been just a matter of giving her a name, Bastian could easily have helped her. He was tops at that. But unfortunately, he was not in Fantastica, where his talents were needed and would even have won him friends and admirers. On the other hand, he was glad not to be there. Not for anything in the world would he have ventured into such a place as the Swamps of Sadness. And then this spooky creature of darkness that was chasing Atreyu without his knowing it. Bastian would have liked to warn him, but that was impossible. All he could do was hope and go on reading. Chapter 4, Igramul de Many. Dire hunger and thirst pursued Atreyu. It was 2 days since he had left the Swamps of Sadness, and since then he had been wandering through an empty rocky wilderness. What little provisions he had taken with him had sunk beneath the black waters with Artax. In vain, Atreyu dug his fingers into the cleft between stones in the hope of finding some little root, but nothing grew there, not even moss or lichen. At first he was glad to feel solid ground beneath his feet, but little by little it came to him that he was worse off than ever. He was lost. He didn't even know what direction he was going in, for the dusky greyness was the same all around him. A cold wind blew over the needle-like rocks that rose up on all sides, blue and blue. Uphill and downhill he plodded, but all he saw was distant mountains, with still more distant ranges behind them, and so on to the horizon on all sides. And nothing living, not a beetle, not an ant, not even the vultures which ordinarily follow the wary traveller until he falls by the wayside. Doubt was no longer possible. This was the land of the dead mountains. Few had seen them, and fewer still escaped from them alive, but they figured in the legends of Atreyu's people. He remembered an old song. Better than huntsmen should perish in the swamps, for in the dead mountains there is a deep, deep chasm, where dwelleth Igramul de Many, the horror of horrors. Even if Atreyu had wanted to turn back, and had known what direction to take, it would not have been possible. He had gone too far, and could only keep on going. If only he himself had been involved, he might have sat down in a cave and quietly waited for death, as the greenskin hunters did. But he was engaged in the great quest. The life of the childlike Empress and all of Fantastica was at stake. He had no right to give up. And so he kept at it, uphill and down. From time to time he realized that he had long been walking as though in his sleep, that his mind had been in other realms, from which they had returned none too willingly. Bastian gave a start. The clock in the belfry struck 1. School was over for the day. He heard the shouts and screams of the children running into the corridors from the classrooms, and the clatter of many feet on the stairs. For a while, there were isolated shouts from the street, and then the schoolhouse was engulfed in silence. The silence descended on Bastian like a great heavy blanket and threatened to smother him. From then on he would be all alone in the big schoolhouse. All that day, all that night, there was no knowing how long. This adventure of his was getting serious. The other children were going home for lunch. Bastian was hungry too, and he was cold, in spite of the army blankets he was wrapped in. Suddenly, he lost heart. His whole plan seemed crazy, senseless. He wanted to go home that very minute. He could just be in time. His father wouldn't have noticed anything yet. Bastian wouldn't even have to tell him he had played hooky. Of course, it would come out sooner or later, but There was time to worry about that. But the stolen book, yes, he'd have to own up to that too. In the end, his father would resign himself, as he did, to all the disappointments Bastien had given him. Anyway, there was nothing to be afraid of. Most likely his father wouldn't say anything, but just go and see Mr. Coriander and straighten things out. Bastien was about to put the copper-colored book into his satchel, but then he stopped. "No," he said aloud in the stillness of the attic. Atreyu wouldn't give up just because things were getting a little rough. "What I've started, I must finish. I've gone too far to turn back. Regardless of what may happen, I have to go forward." He felt very lonely, yet there was a kind of pride in his loneliness. He was proud of standing firm in the face of temptation. He was a little like Atreyu after all. A time came when Atreyu really could not go forward. Before him lay the deep chasm. The grandiose horror of the sight cannot be described in words. A yawning cleft, perhaps half a mile wide, twinned its way through the land of the dead mountains. How deep it might be, there was no way of knowing. Atreyu lay on a spur at the edge of the chasm and stared down into darkness which seemed to extend to the innermost heart of the earth. He picked up a stone the size of a tennis ball and hurled it as far as he could. The stone fell and fell until it was swallowed up in the darkness. Though Atreyu listened a long while, he heard no sound of impact. There was only one thing Atreyu could do, and he did it. He skirted the deep chasm. Every second he expected to meet the horror of horrors known to him from the old song. He had no idea what sort of creature this might be. All he knew was that its name was Igramul. The deep chasm twisted and turned through the mountain waste, and of course there was no path at its edge. Here to there were abrupt rises and falls, and sometimes the ground swayed alarmingly under Atreyu's feet. Sometimes his path was barred by gigantic rock formations, and he would have to feel his way painfully, step by step, around them. Or there would be slopes covered with smooth stones that would start rolling towards the chasm as soon as he set foot on them. More than once he was within a hairbreadth of the edge. If he had known that a pursuer was close behind him and coming closer by the hour, he might have hurried and taken dangerous risks. It was that creature of darkness which had been after him since the start of his journey. Since then its body had taken on recognizable outlines. It was a pitch-black wolf, the size of an ox. Nose to the ground, it trotted along, following Atreyu's trail through the stony desert of the dead mountains. Its tongue hung far out of its mouth, and its terrifying fangs were bared. The freshness of the scent told the wolf that its prey was only a few miles ahead. But suspecting nothing of his pursuer, Atreyu picked his way slowly and cautiously. As he was groping through the darkness of a tunnel under a mountain, he suddenly heard a noise that he couldn't identify because it bore no resemblance to any sound he had ever heard. It was a kind of jangling roar. At the same time, Atreyu felt that the whole mountain about him was trembling, and he heard blocks of stone crashing down its outer walls. For a time, he waited to see whether the earthquake or whatever it might be would abate. Then, since it did not, he crawled to the end of the tunnel and cautiously stuck his head out. And then he saw. An enormous spider web was stretched from edge to edge of the deep chasm. And in the sticky threads of the web, which were as thick as ropes, a great white luck dragon was struggling, becoming more and more entangled as he thrashed about with its tail and claws. Luck dragons are among the strangest animals in Fantastica. They bear no resemblance to ordinary dragons, which look like loathsome snakes and live deep in caves, diffusing a noxious stench and guarding some real or imaginary treasure. Such spawn of chaos are usually wicked or ill-tempered. They have bat-like wings with which they can rise clumsily and noisily into the air, and they spew fire and smoke. Luck dragons are creatures of air, warmth, and pure joy. Despite their great size, they are as light as a summer cloud, and consequently need no wings for flying. They swim in the air of heaven as fish swim in the water. Seen from the earth, they look like slow lightning flashes. The most amazing thing about them is their song. Their voice sounds like the golden note of a large bell, and when they speak softly, the bell seems to be ringing in the distance. Anyone who has heard this sound will remember it as long as he lives and tell his grandchildren about it. But the luck dragon Atreyu saw could hardly have been in a mood for singing. His long, graceful body, with its pearly pink and white scales, hung tangled and twisted in the great spiderweb. His bristling fangs, his thick, luxuriant mane, and the fringes of his tail and limbs were all caught up in the sticky ropes. He could hardly move. The eyeballs in his lion-like head glistened ruby red. The splendid beast bled from many wounds, for there was something else, something very big, that descended like a dark cloud on the dragon's white body. It rose and fell, all the while changing its shape. Sometimes it resembled a gigantic, long-legged spider with many fiery eyes and a fat body encased in shaggy black hair. Then it became a great hand with long claws that tried to crush the luck dragon. And in the next moment, it changed to a giant scorpion, piercing its unfortunate victim with its venomous sting. The battle between the two giants was fearsome. The luck dragon was still defending himself, spewing blue fire that singed the cloud monster's bristles. Smoke came whirling through the crevices in the rock, so foul-smelling that Atreyu could hardly breathe. Once the luck dragon managed to bite off one of the monster's long legs, but instead of falling into the chasm, the severed leg hovered for a time in mid-air, then returned to its old place in the black cloud body. And several times the dragon seemed to seize one of the monster's limbs between its teeth, but bit into the void. Only then did Atreyu notice that the monster was not a single solid body, but was made up of innumerable small steel-blue insects which buzzed like angry hornets. It was their compact swarm that kept taking different shapes. This was Igramul, and now Atreyu knew why she was called the Many. He sprang from his hiding place, reached for the gem, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Stop! In the name of the childlike Empress, stop!" But the hissing and roaring of the combatants drowned out his voice. He himself could barely hear it. Without stopping to think, he set foot on the sticky ropes of the web which swayed beneath him as he ran. He lost his balance, fell, clung by his hands to keep from falling into the dark chasm, pulled himself up again, caught himself in the ropes, fought free and hurried on. At last Igramul sensed that something was coming towards her. With the speed of lightning, she turned about, confronting Atreyu with an enormous steel-blue face, her single eye at a vertical pupil, which stared at Atreyu with inconceivable malignancy. A cry of fear escaped Bastian. A cry of terror passed through the ravine and echoed from side to side. Igramul turned her eye to the left and right to see if someone else had arrived, for that sound could not have been made by the boy who stood there as though paralyzed with horror. Could she have heard me cry? Bastian wondered in alarm. But that's not possible. And then Atreyu heard Igramul's voice. It was very high and slightly hoarse, not at all the kind of voice that had that enormous face. Her lips did not move as she spoke. It was the buzzing of a great swarm of hornets that shaped itself into words. A two-leg, Atreyu heard. Years upon years of hunger, and now 2 tasty morsels at once. A lucky day for Igramul. Atreyu needed all of his strength to keep his composure. He held up the gem, up to the monster's one eye, and asked, "Do you know this emblem?" "Come closer, Two Legs," buzzed the many voices. "Igramul doesn't see well." Atreyu took 1 step closer to the face. The mouth opened, showing innumerable glittering feelers, hooks, and claws in place of a tongue. "Still closer," the swarm buzzed. He took 1 more step, which brought him near enough to distinguish the innumerable steel-blue insects which whirled around in seeming confusion, yet the face as a whole remained motionless. "I am Atreyu," he said. "I have come on a mission from the childlike Empress." "Most inopportune," said the angry buzzing after a time. "What do you want of Igramul? As you can see, she is very busy." "I want this luck dragon," said Atreyu. "Let me have him." "What do you want him for, Atreyu Two Legs?" "I lost my horse in the swamps of sadness. I must go to the southern oracle, because only Uyulala can tell me who can give the childlike empress a new name. If she doesn't get one, she will die, and all Fantastica with her. You too, Igramul." "Ah," the face drawled. "Is that the reason for all the places where there is nothing?" "Yes," said Atreyu. "So you too know of them. But the southern oracle is too long a journey for a lifetime. That's why I'm asking you for this luck dragon. If he carries me through the air, I may get there before it's too late." Out of the whirling swarm that made up the face came a sound suggesting the giggling of many voices. "You're all wrong, Atreyu Two Legs. We know nothing of the southern oracle and nothing of Uyulala, but we do know that this dragon cannot carry you. And even if we were in the best of health, the trip would take so long that the childlike empress would die of her illness in the meantime. You must measure your quest, Atreyu, in terms not of your own life, but of hers." The gaze of the eye with the vertical pupil was almost unbearable. "That's true," he said in a small voice. "Besides," the motionless face went on, "the luck dragon has Igramul's poison in his body. He has less than an hour to live." "Then there's no hope," Atreyu murmured. "Not for him, not for me, and not for you either, Igramul." "Oh well," the voice buzzed. "Igramul would at least have had 1 good meal. But who says it's Igramul's last meal? She knows a way of getting you to the southern oracle in a twinkling. But the question is, will you like it?" "What is that way?" "That is Igramul's secret. The creatures of darkness have their secrets too, Atreyu Two Legs. Igramul has never revealed hers, and you two must swear you'll never tell a soul. For it would be greatly to Igramul's disadvantage if it were known. Yes, greatly to her disadvantage. I swear. Speak!" The great steel-blue face leaned forward just a little and buzzed almost inaudibly. "You must let Igramul bite you." Atreyu shrank back in horror. "Igramul's poison," the voice went on, "kills within an hour. But the one who has it inside him, it gives the power to wish himself in any part of Fantastica he chooses. Imagine if that were known. All Igramul's victims would escape her." "An hour?" cried Atreyu. "What can I do in an hour?" "Well," buzzed the swarm, "at least it's more than all the hours remaining to you here." Atreyu struggled with himself. "Will you set the luck dragon free if I ask it in the name of the childlike empress?" he finally asked. "No," said the face. "You have no right to ask that of Igramul, even if you are wearing Orin the gem. The childlike empress takes us all as we are. That's why Igramul respects her emblem." Atreyu was still standing with bowed head. Igramul had spoken the truth. He couldn't save the white luck dragon. His own wishes didn't count. He looked up and said, "Do what you suggested." Instantly, the blue cloud descended on him and enveloped him on all sides. He felt a numbing pain in his left shoulder. His last thought was, "To the southern oracle." Then the world went black before his eyes. When the wolf reached the spot a short time later, he saw the giant spider web, but there was no one in sight. There the trail he had been following broke off, and try as he might, he could not find it again. Bastian stopped reading. He felt miserable, as though he himself had Igramul's poison inside him. "Thank God I'm not in Fantastica," he muttered. "Luckily, such monsters don't exist in reality. Anyway, it's only a story." But was it only a story? How did it happen that Igramul, and probably Atreyu as well, had heard Bastian's cry of terror? Little by little, this book was beginning to give him a spooky feeling. Chapter 5. The Gnomics. Ever so slowly, Atreyu awoke to the world. He saw that he was still in the mountains, and for a terrible moment he suspected that Igramul had deceived him. But these, he soon realized, were entirely different mountains. They seemed to consist of great rust-red blocks of stone, piled in such a way as to form a strange tower and pyramid. In between those structures, the ground was covered with bushes and shrubberies. The air was blazing hot. The country was bathed in glaring sunlight. Shading his eyes with his hand, Atreyu looked around him and discovered about a mile away an irregularly shaped arch, perhaps 100 feet high. It too appeared to consist of piled stone blocks. Could that be the entrance to the southern oracle? As far as he could see, there was nothing behind the arch, only an endless empty plain. No building, no temple, no grove, nothing suggesting an oracle. Suddenly, while he was wondering what to do, he heard a deep, bronze-like voice. "Atreyu," and then again, "Atreyu." Turning around, he saw the white luck dragon emerging from one of the rust-red towers. Blood was pouring from his wounds, and he was so weak he could barely drag himself along. "Here I am, Atreyu," he said merrily, winking one of his ruby-red eyes. "And you needn't be so surprised. I was pretty well paralyzed when I was caught in that spider web, but I heard everything Igramul said to you. So I thought to myself, she has bitten me too. After all, so why shouldn't I take advantage of the secret as well? That's how I got away from her." Atreyu was overjoyed. "I hated leaving you to Igramul," he said, "but what could I do?" "Nothing," said the luck dragon. "You've saved my life all the same, even if I had something to do with it." And again he winked, this time with the other eye. "Saved your life," Atreyu repeated. "For an hour? That's all we have left. I can feel Igramul's poison burning my heart away." "Every poison has an antidote," said the white dragon. "Everything will turn out all right. You'll see." "I can't imagine how," said Atreyu. Neither can I, said the luck dragon. But that's the wonderful part of it. From now on, you'll succeed in everything you attempt, because I'm a luck dragon. Even when I was caught in the web, I didn't give up hope. And as you see, I was right. Atreyu smiled. Tell me, why did you wish yourself here and not in some other place where you might have been cured? My life belongs to you, said the dragon, if you'll accept it. I thought you'd need a mount for this great quest of yours. And you'll soon see that crawling around the country on 2 legs, or even galloping on a good horse, can't hold a candle to whizzing through the air on the back of a luck dragon. Are we partners? We're partners, said Atreyu. By the way, said the dragon, my name is Falkor. Glad to meet you, said Atreyu. But while we're talking, what little time we have left is seeping away. I've got to do something, but what? Have luck, said Falkor. What else? But Atreyu heard no more. He had fallen down and lay motionless in the soft folds of the dragon's body. Igramu's poison was taking effect. When Atreyu, no one knows how much later, opened his eyes again, he saw nothing but a very strange face bent over him. It was the wrinkliest, shriveledest face he had ever seen, and only about the size of a fist. It was as brown as a baked apple, and the eyes in it glittered like stars. The head was covered with a bonnet made of withered leaves. Atreyu felt a little drinking cup held to his lips. Nice medicine, good medicine, mumbled the wrinkled little lips in the shriveled face. Just drink, child, do you good. Atreyu sipped. It tasted strange, kind of sweet and sour. Atreyu found it painful to speak. What about the white dragon? He asked. Doing fine, the voice whispered. Don't worry, my boy. You'll get well. You'll both get well. The worst is over. Just drink. Drink. Atreyu took another swallow, and again sleep overcame him. But this time it was the deep, refreshing sleep of recovery. The clock in the belfry struck 2. Bastian couldn't hold it any longer. He simply had to go. He had felt the need for quite some time, but he hadn't been able to stop reading. Besides, he had been afraid to go downstairs. He told himself that there was nothing to worry about, that the building was deserted, that no one would see him, but still he was afraid, as if the school were a person watching him. But in the end, there was no help for it. He just had to go. He set the open book down on the mat, went to the door and listened with pounding heart. Nothing. He slid the bolt and slowly turned the big key in the lock. When he pressed the handle, the door opened, creaking loudly. He padded out in his stocking feet, leaving the door behind him open to avoid unnecessary noise. He crept down the stairs to the 2nd floor. The student's toilet was at the other end of the long corridor with the spinach-green classroom door. Racing against time, Bastian ran as fast as he could and just made it. As he sat there, he wondered why heroes in stories like the one he was reading never had to worry about such problems. Once, when he was much younger, he had asked his religion teacher if Jesus Christ had had to go like an ordinary person. After all, he had taken food and drink like everyone else. The class had howled with laughter, and the teacher, instead of an answer, had given him several demerits for insolence. He hadn't meant to be insolent. Probably, Bastian now said to himself, these things are just too unimportant to be mentioned in stories. Yet for him, they could be of the most pressing and embarrassing importance. He was finished. He pulled the chain and was about to leave when he heard steps in the corridor outside. One classroom door after another was opened and closed, and the step came closer and closer. Bastian's heart pounded in his throat. Where could he hide? He stood glued to the spot as though paralyzed. The washroom door opened, luckily in such a way as to shield Bastien. The janitor came in. One by one he looked into the stalls. When he came to the one where the water was still running and the chain swaying a little, he hesitated for a moment and mumbled something to himself. But when the water stopped running, he shrugged his shoulders and went out. His steps died away on the stairs. Bastien hadn't dared breathe the whole time, and now he gasped for air. He noticed that his knees were trembling. As fast as possible, he padded down the corridor with the spinach-green doors, up the stairs and back into the attic. Only when the door was locked and bolted behind him did he relax. With a deep sigh, he settled back on his pile of mats, wrapped himself in his army blankets, and reached for the book. When Atreyu awoke for the second time, he felt perfectly rested and well. He sat up. It was night, the moon was shining bright, and Atreyu saw he was in the same place where he and the white dragon had collapsed. Falkor was still lying there. His breathing came deep and easy, and he seemed to be fast asleep. His wounds had been dressed. Atreyu noticed that his own shoulder had been dressed in the same way, not with cloth, but with herbs and plant fibers. Only a few steps away there was a small cave from which issued a faint beam of light. Taking care not to move his left arm, Atreyu stood up cautiously and approached the cave. Bending down, for the entrance was very low, he saw a room that looked like an alchemist's workshop in miniature. At the back, an open fire was crackling merrily. Crucibles, retorts, and strangely shaped flasks were scattered all about. Bundles of dried plants were piled on shelves. The little table in the middle of the room and the other furniture seemed to be made of root wood, crudely nailed together. Atreyu heard a cough, and then he saw a little man sitting in an armchair by the fire. The little man's hat had been carved from a root and looked like an inverted pipe bowl. The face was as brown and shriveled as the face Atreyu had seen leaning over him when he first woke up, but this one was wearing big eyeglasses, and the features seemed sharper and more anxious. The little man was reading a big book that was laying on his lap. Then a second little figure, which Atreyu recognized as the one that had been bent over him, came waddling out of another room. Now Atreyu saw that this little person was a woman. Apart from her bonnet of leaves, she, like the man in the armchair, was wearing a kind of monk's robe, which also seemed to be made of withered leaves. Humming merrily, she rubbed her hands and busied herself with a kettle that was hanging over the fire. Neither of the little people would have reached up to Atreyu's knee. Obviously, they belonged to the widely ramified family of the gnomes, though to a rather obscure branch. "Woman," said the little man testily, "get out of my light. You are interfering with my research." "You and your research," said the woman. "Who cares about that? The important thing is my health elixir. Those two outside are in urgent need of it." "Those two," said the man irritably, "will be far more in need of my help and advice." "Maybe so," said the little woman, "but not until they are well. Move over, old man." Grumbling, the little man moved his chair a short distance from the fire. Atreyu cleared his throat to call attention to his presence. The two gnomes looked around. "He's already well," said the little man. "Now it's my turn." "Certainly not," the little woman hissed. "He'll be well when I say so. It'll be your turn when I say it's your turn." She turned to Atreyu. "We would invite you in, but it's not quite big enough, is it? Just a moment, we shall come out to you." Taking a small mortar, she ground something or other into a powder, which she tossed into the kettle. Then she washed her hands, dried them on her robe, and said to the little man, "Stay here until I call you. Engiwuk, understand?"
"Yes, Urgle, I understand," the little man grumbled. "I understand only too well."
The female gnome came out of the cave and looked up at Atreyu from under knitted brows.
Well, well, we seem to be getting better, don't we?"
Atreyu nodded. The gnome climbed up on a rocky ledge, level with Atreyu's face, and sat down.
"No pain?"
she asked. "None worth mentioning," Atreyu answered.
"Nonsense," the old woman snapped. "Does it hurt, or doesn't it?"
"It still hurts," said Atreyu, "but it doesn't matter."
"Not to you, perhaps, but it does to me. Since when does the patient tell the doctor what matters? What do you know about it? If it's to get well, it has to hurt. If it stopped hurting, your arm would be dead."
"I'm sorry," said Atreyu, who felt like a scolded child. "I only wanted to say, that is, I wanted to thank you."
"What for?"
said Urgle impatiently.
"I'm a healer, after all. I've only done my professional duty. Besides, Engiwuk, that's my old man, saw the glory hang on your neck. So what would you expect?"
"What about Falkor?" Atreyu asked. "How's he getting along?"
"Falkor? Who's that?"
"The white luck dragon."
"Oh, I don't know yet. Took a little more punishment than you, but then he's bigger and stronger, so he ought to make it. Why not? Needs a little more rest. Where did you ever pick up that poison? And where have you come from all of a sudden? And where are you going? And who are you in the first place?"
Engiwuk was standing in the mouth of the cave. He listened as Atreyu answered Urgle's questions. When Urgle opened her mouth to speak again, he shouted,
"Hold your tongue, woman! Now it's my turn!"
Removing his pipe bowl hat, he scratched his bald head and said,
"Don't let her tone bother you, Atreyu. Old Urgle is a little crude, but she means no harm. My name is Engiwuk. We are the well-known Gnomics. Ever heard of us?"
"No," Atreyu confessed. Engiwuk seemed rather offended.
"Oh well," he said. "Apparently you don't move in scientific circles, or someone would undoubtedly have told you that you couldn't find a better advisor than yours truly if you're looking for Oyulala and the Southern Oracle. You've come to the right address, my boy." "Don't give yourself airs," Urgle broke in. Then she climbed down from her ledge and, grumbling to herself, vanished into the cave. Engiwuk ignored her comment. "I can explain everything," he went on. "I've studied the question all my life, inside and out. I set up my observatory just for that. I'm in the last stage of a great scientific work on the Oracle. The Riddle of Oyulala solved by Professor Engiwuk. That's the title. Sounds all right, doesn't it? To be published in the very near future. Unfortunately, a few details are still lacking. You can help me, my boy?" "An observatory?" asked Atreyu, who had never heard the word. Engiwuk nodded, and beaming with pride, motioned Atreyu to follow him. A narrow path twinned its way upwards between great stone blocks. In some places, where the grade was especially steep, tiny steps had been cut out of the stone. Of course, they were much too small for Atreyu's feet, and he simply stepped over them. Even so, he had a hard time keeping up with the gnome. "Bright moonlight tonight," said Engiwuk. "You'll see them all right." "See who?" Atreyu asked. "Oyulala?" Engiwuk only frowned and shook his head. At last, they came to the top of the hill. The ground was flat, but on one side there was a natural stone parapet. In the middle of this wall there was a hole, obviously the work of Gnomian hands. And behind the hole, on a stand made of rootwood, stood a small telescope. Engiwuk looked through the telescope and made a slight adjustment by turning some screws. Then he nodded with satisfaction and invited Atreyu to look. To put himself on a level with it, Atreyu had to lie down on the ground and prop himself on his elbows. The telescope was aimed at the great stone arch, or more specifically, at the lower part of the left pillar. And besides this pillar, as Atreyu now saw, an enormous sphinx was sitting motionless in the moonlight. The 4 paws on which she was propped were those of a lion. The
The hindquarters were those of a bull. On her back she bore the wings of an eagle, and her face was that of a human woman. In form, at any rate, for the expression was far from human. It was hard to tell whether this face was smiling, or whether it expressed deep grief or utter indifference. After looking at it for some time, Atreyu seemed to see abysmal wickedness and cruelty, but a moment later he had to correct his impression, for he found only unruffled calm. "Don't bother," he heard the gnome's deep voice in his ear. "You won't solve it. It's the same with everyone. I've observed it all my life, and I haven't found the answer. Now for the other one." He turned one of the screws. The image passed the opening of the arch, through which one saw only the empty plain. Then the right-hand pillar came into Atreyu's view, and there, in the same posture, sat a second sphinx. The enormous body shimmered like liquid silver in the moonlight. She seemed to be staring fixedly at the first, just as the first was gazing fixedly at her. "Are they statues?" asked Atreyu, unable to avert his eyes.
"Oh no," said Enguic with a giggle. "They are real-life sphinxes, very much alive. You've seen enough for now. Come, and we'll go down. I'll explain everything."
And he held his hand in front of the telescope so that Atreyu could see no more. Neither spoke on the way back. Thus ends Chapter 5.